Hi, everybody. Welcome to Live and in Coffee. Cheers.
Cheers.
Today, we are in our favorite coffee shop, which is Abigail's home, because Abigail is so busy that this is the time that we could find. So coffee came to us today, and we're here to talk about Present Perfect and Abigail's journey with Live and in Color. Abigail, how did you get involved in Live and in Color? How did we suck you in?
Well, once upon a time, I went to college at Marymount Manhattan College on the Upper East Side. And I was one of two directors of color in the entire program, like from senior to freshman level, like throughout all 4 years, there were two of us. And Dev was brought in as a guest artist one year to workshop, PANGEA, which was they had just done that musical at the camp the year before. That was Janet No and Lee Summers' project. And so they brought it in to workshop it with the students. And one of the principles that Dev has when he goes into educational institutions is to make sure that, people of color and artists of color and students of color are given more opportunity to practice our craft and to hone our skills. And so as part of that, when he came to Marymount, he told my professor who ran the program at the time that he wanted to work with a director of color as an assistant. Well, generally at Marymount, within their course curriculum, you don't really assist after your sophomore year. After in your junior and senior years, you're primarily doing your own projects, doing your own directing projects, running, like basically directing your own stuff. But I happened to have a break in my schedule for that January term. And so it was like, I had just gotten home for the holidays and I got a call from my professor and he was like, hey, I know that generally, seniors don't really do assistant directing work, but we have this opportunity with Devin Janke. He's coming in for Pangea, which you may have heard. They've already cast it, but he's looking for an assistant, and he really wants that to be a person of color. And I think you would be an excellent fit. And I was like, yeah, of course I'd be an excellent fit. I'm one of two people in the program.
Yep.
But so I was paired with him, and I was like, yeah, I don't really have anything going on in January, other than my retail job. So yeah. I was like,
where did you work retail?
Paper Source.
Yeah.
Paper Source on 3rd Avenue, on the Upper East Side. I worked there for 3 or 4 years in college. Taught workshops, stationery, crafts, all those things. I was a professional gift wrapper there.
Incredible job.
And continued doing that for a few years after college too. Quite enjoy it. So met Dev there, and then worked with him throughout that month. And we really hit it off. We got along really well. And so after the show closed, he took me to dinner and wined and dined me. And at the time I was also working at the Atlantic Theater Company in their development department, doing some grant writing, research, institutional development primarily. And he was looking for someone to assist him in fundraising at the time. And I was like, yeah, I don't mind helping out. I think that, you and I get along really well. And I'm really interested in the mission of this company you're trying to build, because, at the time up to that point, my primary entry into the industry was very much in predominantly white institutions. Mm-hmm. I had never worked with a company that was thinking about foregrounding people who looked like me in that way. Mm-hmm. And so when Dev was telling me about what he was building, I was like, oh, that's dope as fuck. Mm-hmm. Like, I was like, oh, wow. So like a place in which like a piece like Pangea is not only like existing, but like there are 7 other Pangeas that have been done and will be done in the future. Like, not literally that show, but
yeah.
But
one for every continent.
Exactly. And so yeah, he convinced me there. I was in that sort of development associate position until ultimately I was offered another position in development that was a little more full-time with an institution in New York City called Musical Theater Factory. Dev has been very accommodating of that journey, and like as we work together artistically on projects at Live and in Color and projects that have gone through Live and in Color and then gone to the commercial sphere, he's always been very supportive of me as an artist. And so, he's found ways in which the company has evolved with us as we've grown.
Will you tell me what Pangea is about?
Pangea is about, so it's about these 7 continent siblings who are also, this is sort of mirrored in the world of the NYU Graduate Musical Theater Writing Program.
Okay, cool.
So there are these 7 students who are also like playing interpersonal roles within their like collaborations in their lives, and it's sort of played out in the execution of writing the show. So it's kind of meta in that way.
Okay.
But the concept of Pangea is that like there are these 7 continent siblings, the 7 continents personified as like this family unit, and as happened in geological history, the 7 continents split apart, and the piece sort of asks the question of like how to find unity again, or how can we, find common ground, even though, because at one point the world was one, and how do we become one again? Dev has told me on multiple occasions, like when I met him and when we were talking about the show initially, he was like, when they sent me the show, it was just the continent stuff. And he was like, and what was happening was like people were pinning them for like children's theater or like young audiences. And he was like, and when I was talking to the writers, that wasn't their intention. And like, some of the stuff that they're talking about is actually not really like suitable for like children, because there's this whole moment at the end where it becomes this sort of vaudevillian exercise of like cultural appropriation, which is very powerful, also very shocking.
Yeah.
And that there was something really bold about that was like, I don't want them to have to compromise this like bold narrative in favor of them selling out commercially to these places that want to be more driven towards young audience, because that's the way it sells.
Right.
So that was actually Dev's idea to.
That's really exciting. I feel like something that I find that is really different about Live and in Color and a lot of other new development organizations is that sort of commercially minded approach, but not with the goal of selling out. I think that that's like a conversation we've been having a lot in strategic planning and things, is that we want all of our shows to be successful, that, we want every Live and in Color show goes to Broadway, but I think that the goal is that the artistry of the people making the thing is in symbiosis with the commercialism.
Absolutely.
And that there's not an artistic compromise that has to get made to make it commercialized, which I think is something that is sort of constantly in combat. We talk a lot in our industry about, it feels that there's this war between product and process, and between artistry and commercialism, and like, do you want your show to be successful or do you want it to be artistic? And I think that there's this implication that it can't be both. And I think that something that is really special about that story and just Live and in Color's ethos in general is that we're fighting to make both happen at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in so many ways, like financial equity and like the ways in which finance intersects with the art making and capitalism in this whole equation, is really what has perpetuated a lot of the issues that we're seeing in the larger industry, is just access to resources, access to education, and access to like just cash money. And what I really appreciate about Dev's approach is that, there are a lot of organizations out there that are helping in the developmental sphere, and that support is like also incredibly necessary. And like Live and in Color still does sit as an artist service organization, but in the fact that we understand that in order to have wide influence, in order to have impact, artists have to have resources. And in order to get those resources, there has to be a mind, a vision, a goal, an orientation towards understanding what it means to be commercially viable, and not in the sense of like we were saying, like selling out, or that things are written with a predominantly white, predominantly cis, predominantly het audience in mind, but that these artists that are making these works are able to profit from them. And by empowering artists with the resources to profit from their material, you're inherently feeding the cycle, so that those people that now have resource will feed it back into the ecosystem, and it continues, right? And then that's how you start to decolonize and deconstruct the ways that commercial Broadway has operated historically. And I think, we're all asking ourselves a question in the industry right now, and like, is the Broadway model sustainable? And I don't know. I have complicated feelings about it, because I think in order for something to be sustainable, it has to be rooted in community and it has to be rooted in impact. And historically, the Broadway industry as a whole has not been reflective of the community that New York City is and operate. It operates to those cis het rich white people and tourists. And not saying that tourists shouldn't enjoy Broadway, or that they can't enjoy Broadway, or that, Broadway shouldn't be for them. It should absolutely be for them. But like, you think about the ticket prices that are currently on Broadway, and like, how
Not
are
everybody can afford them.
Not everyone can afford them. And artists are also making work, and at least we found artists are making work that are responsive to very specific communities that need resource. And I think the more art making continues to move towards and evolve towards community impact is really going to be where we start to see and solve some of these imbalances and inequities that we're seeing on Broadway currently. That's been huge, and like the inspiration of the June Bingham Commission, for example, which is the project that I'm currently leading here at Live and in Color. Something that we ask our artists each year in the interview and selection process is like, what is the impact you hope that this piece will have on an audience or on a community? And I think that probably one of the best examples of this is the Wetlands, which I think that was the first year you with us. Wetlands! But this was our Dinoxis piece that we commissioned in 2022. And for those of you at home watching this, definitely go look them up. They're amazing. And
if you don't know the Wetlands, you're missing out.
You are missing out. But the piece was originally commissioned, and we brought it up to the camp. And something that was really important for our Artized process, which is, again, sort of speaks to the elasticity and responsiveness of Live and in Color as an organization, is, we're able to have dialogue with these artists about like, what is your process? What do you need? How can we make these pooled resources that we have available, which, however small they might be, fit the needs that you have in order to make this thing come to life in a way that feels good for you? It's really an opportunity to land on that springboard, so that we have people who are like really ready to like take off on that next part of their career journey, and like, how can we support that launch?
My last question is a bit of a doozy, and feel free to answer it in whatever way you want to. But if you could change one thing about the theater industry, if you were president for a day, what would be the one thing? What's the hill you're going to die on?
Accessibility in all the ways. I think that there are certainly some access needs that are met by commercial Broadway at this point. Like, you can go and get some of these like assisted listening devices. There are some theaters that are offering sensory friendly performances for people who have autism or have loved ones who have autism, in order to be able to experience some of these shows that might have a lot of stuff going on that could be very overwhelming and make it very difficult for someone to participate. But I think that the industry as a whole needs to really hold and be accountable for the ways in which financial access, like we were talking about earlier, ticket prices just being incredibly outlandish for like shit seats, frankly. Like, like you're gonna throw me up at the top of the balcony for $40. So that means if two people are going, that's $80. That's
$40 if you're lucky.
Right. Exactly. I'm like, that's groceries for a week. That's that's part of someone's electric bill. That's part of someone's rent. Like, so like financial access is only one part of that equation though, right? Like we were talking about like ASL interpretation, like how is the industry reckoning with that? People who have sensory issues or experience different, levels of overwhelm or overload. How are we building in safe spaces for that, or like quiet spaces for that? People who have other access needs, whether it be physical disability or other disabilities that might prevent them from gathering in person. If it's a chronic illness, how are we sort of protecting the most vulnerable in our communities? And that's something that is kind of at the forefront of like all the work I do. And there's never a simple like answer, right? Because particularly when it comes to vulnerable communities, when you're talking about like in-person programming, right? Like there are people who experience chronic illness and might not still not be able to go out in public in the same way that they were able to pre-pandemic, may need to, be around people who are masked, only be able to come to events that are masked. But if you're not thinking about intersectionality in terms of access, that can be an issue, because, for example, people who need that mask separation, okay, great, we make the event masked. But if those masks aren't clear, somebody who is hearing impaired can't communicate as well, because they rely on reading people's lips.
Yeah, it's not a one-size-fits-all answer. It's a lot about every production, every artist, every audience, and taking the steps. And I know we were talking earlier about process versus product and artistry versus capitalism, and it feels like accessibility versus budget is often something that gets talked about, which is like really terrible.
Yeah.
That it feels like sometimes people have financial barriers to accessibility of installing ramps, hiring an ASL interpreter, doing these things. I think that it's really easy for us to say that we want everything to be accessible, but ultimately it relies on a certain degree of capital, which is where I will stand on my final soapbox with you at Live and in Coffee and say that if you want to see these things change in the theater industry as well, I really hope that you'll consider supporting Live and in Color. You can support us at liveandincolor.org/donate. Even the price of your coffee can help artists and help us change the industry and make it a more accessible and equitable space. Abigail, thank you so much. I get to talk to you all the time about the future of theater, and I'm so glad that the people at home now also get to hear your genius thoughts and journey with the organization. So cheers, and goodbye to everyone.